And so our plan is to have both the slides and the audio posted on the website in due course. These slides will be up more quickly than the audio. Okay, can we go ahead, please? Just as a reminder that the Ethics Practitioners Association of Canada promotes ethical practices in organizations and supports ethics practitioners across Canada through networking and through educational opportunities. And this webinar is a prime example of that sort of opportunity. It's the fourth one that we're doing this year. We plan to continue on with webinars in the coming years. And this is in aid of our vision of a world where people in organizations are ethically aware and act ethically. You can find the information on our website, and we very much encourage you to become a member. Next slide, please. So, Ryan, please take over at this point, and I'll mute my machine here unless you call on me.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Bob. Hi, everybody. Glad to be here today and glad to introduce Dr. Mary Gentile. She's developed and written the book called Giving Voice to Values based on her Harvard research. She's a university professor and worldwide educator and consultant. Giving Voice to Values has been piloted in over 920 times in mostly educational and business settings. And those pilot sites include the US, Europe, Africa, India, China, Australia, Canada, Israel, and the United Arab Emirates, to name a few. Giving Voice to Values has been a featured part of the UN Global Compact, PRME, Principles for Responsible Management Education. So we're quite excited to have Mary here today, and you know, I'm a big fan of her work and have her book, and you know, am very honored to have her speak. So we're going to hand over, welcome Mary, and we're going to hand over the rights to change the slides to you in just 1 second here. There you go.
So thank you. So I think I can try and go forward here.
Yeah, it just usually takes a second, Mary. Yeah.
Oops, I think I went too fast there. Let me try going back. Ah, there we are. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Bob and Ryan. I'm really delighted to be here today. I'm always thrilled to have the opportunity to talk about giving voice to values. It's as Ryan and Bob mentioned, it's a new approach to values-driven leadership development. It's increasingly growing and being used around the world, and I'm really delighted to have the chance to share a little bit about it with you today. What I hope to do is to spend you know, maybe 30 minutes or so talking about just what GVV, I call it GVV, Giving Voice to Values, what GVV is and how it's being used and some of the core concepts behind it. And then I hope we'll have 20 to 25 minutes at the end to have some conversation with you all. I'd love for you to be thinking about any questions you have as I'm describing it, any suggestions you might have about ways to expand and enhance this work, and also the opportunity to discuss how you might find it useful in your own work. I understand that people who are on the webinar today come from various backgrounds, so I wanted to kind of reassure you that although I developed this work for use in business education, primarily for use in MBA education, it's actually being used well beyond that now. It's being used not only in graduate business education, but in executive education, in undergraduate business education. It's being used in many corporations around the world. I've started working with the U.S. military. We've worked with the Australian police force. The work has been, as Ryan said, it's been used on all 7 continents. The numbers that he cited are actually woefully out of date now. It's being used in many more places and continues to grow. So I'm delighted to have the chance to talk to you about how it might be adapted for your own organizations. We're also starting to work with legal and medical, engineering, and other professions as well as business. I like to tell people that GVV, Giving Voice to Values, really grew out of my own crisis of faith. As Ryan mentioned, I started my career at Harvard Business School, where I was for 10 years. I helped to design and create their first required curriculum around values and ethics and leadership. And after I left there in the mid-90s, I was working with a number of different business schools and companies on similar issues, and I basically became discouraged. I began to think that the work we were doing around business ethics education, both in business schools and in companies, was at best futile and at worst kind of hypocritical. It felt to me that the conversations we would have about these issues, typically what we would do is we would, share the models of ethical reasoning, and we would, share the relevant laws, regulations, corporate values, and codes, and we would give people thorny ethical dilemmas and ask them to debate them. And, what I found is people walked out of those conversations often more confused and less empowered. And because of all of that, I decided to take a break from this work. I just felt that life is short, and I wanted to do something that actually was, going to be helpful. I'm sorry, I seem to have a quick finger here, and so I took a break from the work. But around that time, I actually a number of different experiences led me to think about a new approach, a new way to think about doing ethics and values-driven leadership development, and that's what Giving Voice to Values grew out of. I'm not going to give you the whole history of how that developed today, because this is going to be a briefer presentation. But what I am going to do is try and share with you a bit about how it's different from traditional approaches and why it works. And so I'll spend a little bit of time on that for you now. I think the first thing for you to know is that Giving Voice to Values grew out of, the main idea behind Giving Voice to Values, if you don't remember anything else from what I say on this webinar today, is that it's about asking and answering a different question when it comes to ethics and values and leadership in organizations. So instead of asking the typical and traditional question, which is what is the right thing to do in any particular situation, or even asking whether it's possible to do the right thing, or what so many academics ask, which is why do good people do the wrong thing? Instead of asking any of those questions, GVV, Giving Voice to Values, is about asking and hopefully answering a different question, which is, once you know what you believe the right thing to do is in any particular organizational situation, how do you get it done? What do you need to say? To whom? In what sequence? What will the pushback be? What will the objections be? In Giving Voice to Values language, we call those the reasons and rationalizations. And then what will you say when you encounter those objections? And is this a conversation that you're going to do one-on-one? Or is this something where you need to generate a group of allies, a kind of coalition? And is this a conversation, a one-off sort of situation? Or is this more of a systemic issue, which therefore needs to be addressed systemically, incrementally, over time? And what kinds of data do you need to gather to make your arguments? And do you need to reframe the whole challenge in a way that makes it easier for your organization or the relevant individuals to come to a different conclusion? Those are the kinds of questions we ask with Giving Voice to Values. As one business school dean put it, Giving Voice to Values is post-decision making. In other words, we invite people to think about how to get the right thing done. And the reason we have shifted to this new question is actually because of a lot of research that I started to encounter. I think I told you that, a number of years ago, before I developed GVV, I was pretty discouraged with this whole thing, and really took a step back from efforts to work in values-driven leadership development and business ethics education. But around that time, I began to encounter a number of different kinds of research, all of which seem to suggest that if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, that rehearsal, practice, pre-scripting, and peer coaching can be a very effective way to do this. Some of the early research that I encountered was back when I was still at Harvard, where I ran into two different studies. They were, brought to my attention by a colleague, two different studies by two different scholars, Douglas Hunneke and Perry London, both of whom were trying to look at what they were calling the question of moral courage. I tend to frame it more as moral competence, but what they both decided to do was to identify a cohort of people who had acted with great conviction under times of high stakes, high risk, and to do in-depth qualitative interviews with them to try and find out whether they had any common experiences, background, family history, education, etc. And they both independently decided that the population they would interview were folks who are often referred to as rescuers from World War II. These are the folks who acted to protect others from the Holocaust, putting their own lives at risk often in the process. And what they found when they did these interviews, they found a number of things that the folks tended to share. But the one that really resonated with me, probably because I was an educator, is that they said that these folks who acted with this kind of conviction in these times of high stakes, high risk, all reported that at an earlier point in their lives, usually as a young adult, they had had the experience with someone more senior to them, usually a boss, a teacher, a mentor, even a parent. They'd had the experience of rehearsing out loud, what would you do if? And then various kinds of moral conflicts. So they literally had the experience of pre-scripting themselves and rehearsing. And this was a process that occurred at both the cognitive level as well as the behavioral level. At the cognitive level, they identified the values that mattered to them. They put an articulation to them, a script. But at the behavioral level, they really had the experience of voicing them out loud to someone more senior to them who stood in as proxy for the kind of person they might need to communicate with in the actual circumstances. So this research kind of triggered this question for me about the value of rehearsal. And I started looking around, and sure enough, this was about 10 years ago, there was starting to be a lot of research in a lot of different disciplines that supported this idea. There's even more now, but in the field of social psychology, there's been research about habit formation. There's also a group of folks whose research is often referred to as the study of positive deviance. These are people who deviate from the norm, but in a positive direction. And one of the leading lights in that group, a guy named Jeremy Sternin, has an interesting phrase, and this is his language, not mine. He says that if you want to have an impact on people's behavior, rather than asking them to think their way into a different way of acting, it's often more effective to ask them to act their way into a different way of thinking. There was also research in the field of the cognitive neurosciences, which is not my field, but I spoke with scholars in that field, and there's research that you've probably read some of the popularizations about as well around brain plasticity and creating new neural pathways, and how rehearsal can create more of a tendency, a predilection to say and do certain things. But the research I like to cite, and I'll share it with you briefly now because I think it really helps folks to remember what I'm talking about, is from the field of kinesthetics, or the study of physical movement. And I'm just going to tell you a brief story because I think it will help you really grasp this idea behind GVV. Back when I was working at Harvard Business School, I decided to take a self-defense class. Now, I'd never felt the need to take a self-defense class till I went to work at Harvard Business School. I think there might be something connected there. But anyways, I looked around Boston, and there were a lot of these courses, and they all teach pretty much the same thing. They teach you the physical moves, fist to bridge of nose, and heel to instep, and knee to groin, and you practice them in the air. And the idea is that now, if you ever run into a situation where it's needed, you know what to do. So most of the courses were like that, but I found one course that was slightly different. It was called model mugging, and it was a developmental model. So they would in fact still teach you these physical moves in the air, but then once you'd learned the moves, they'd bring in a gentleman in a padded suit like the Michelin Man, and they would line us all up, and we would take turns being attacked by this individual, and you would get the chance to use these behaviors full force on another person who was protected by padding. And in the beginning, it was a little ludicrous because you just waited your turn to get attacked. But as the class went on, week after week, eventually, you know, I'd be talking to someone on my left, and he would come up on my right and grab me. You never knew when. You never knew what hold he was going to use. It was utterly nerve-wracking. But they explained to us that the idea behind this was some research that those of you on this call who are athletes will be familiar with. It's the idea of muscle memory, specific state muscle memory, which is the idea that if you rehearse something, you practice it in the same physiological and cognitive and emotional state that you will be in when you need to use it, that even if you freeze in those moments, your body will remember. So the idea was, you know, we would, you know, get attacked by this guy. We could use these moves, and we were creating this kind of muscle memory. So one day I'm lying on my back on the floor, having failed to effectively defend myself, and I'm thinking, gee, you know, I wonder if we could create a kind of moral muscle memory. I wonder if you could create a default behavior, which would be a default to voice, but not just to speaking up. You know, these days everyone talks about speak up cultures. And what I've learned from my research is that that's not really the whole story. It's really a default to informed voice, because part of what I learned as I gathered stories from people about times when they voiced and acted on their values is that the kinds of objections that we typically face got repetitious very quickly. In fact, we identified the four that we heard most frequently, and that although they were powerful, they were not invulnerable to response. And so there is actually the opportunity to rehearse, to practice responses that are more likely to be effective. In fact, most of the folks that I interviewed who had found ways to effectively act on their values didn't just, you know, shake their fist and stomp their foot and, you know, speak truth to power. It wasn't really so much a matter of moral courage. It was more a matter of moral competence. They were skillful. They reframed challenges. They understood what was influencing the people they were trying to interact with. They found ways to bring the emotion down. They found ways to reframe the challenge so that stakes were lower for the affected parties, etc. So, you know, those were all the kinds of things that you know, kind of led me to think maybe we need a new approach. That's the research, this emphasis on rehearsal. So when I learned that, or when I observed that, I started looking at, well, what do we really do already in our ethics education, whether it's in a business school or whether it's a corporate training program or anything else. And what I learned is that we typically do two things. We teach awareness, which basically means we expose our employees, our colleagues, our students to a lot of scenarios that will that involve various kinds of values and ethical and legal conflicts, so that they'll recognize them when they see them. This is a hugely important thing, of course. And the other thing we do is we teach analysis. We expose them to, if it's in an academic setting, we expose them to models of ethical reasoning that come from philosophy, deontology, utilitarianism, and so forth. If it's in a corporate setting or an organizational setting, we expose them to the relevant laws, regulations, the corporate codes, the organizational value statement, etc. And then again, we give them scenarios and we ask them to identify whether a particular action is appropriate or not. Is it over the line or not? This is all a great way for people to learn to recognize issues and to understand, but it doesn't necessarily prepare them for action. And that's what I started to realize, is that even perversely, with the best of intentions, this approach, focusing on awareness and analysis, can actually be a kind of schooling for sophistry. Because one of the things I've started to observe is that people would end up rehearsing or practicing all the ways that you might justify actions that you or I might otherwise consider unethical or irresponsible, using a kind of very clever application of ethical reasoning. And so what I realized is we needed a different pedagogy. We needed a different teaching technology that would actually allow us to rehearse values-driven action. And that was really the insight that led to GVV. But at that point, I realized, well, we need to have this new teaching technology. And I was very familiar with the case study method, because when I'd been at Harvard, I had both written many case studies that had gone platinum, but I also ran the whole case writing program and hired and trained the 60+ case writers for the business school. And you know, you're familiar with case studies. You know, they present a challenge and they end with usually a senior leader who is reflecting on how he or she might you know, act. What should they do? We decided that that's a great way to teach about awareness and analysis, but it doesn't necessarily teach action. So we decided to create a different kind of case. We call them the Giving Voice to Values thought experiment. And what's different about these cases is, first of all, they're very brief. Secondly, they don't just feature senior leaders, they feature people at every level in the organization. But the big difference in these scenarios is that they end with a protagonist who's already decided what the right thing to do is. They're post-decision making. And the protagonist is not asking, what should I do? The protagonist is asking, how can I get the right thing done? And what the learners, whether they are colleagues, employees, or students, engage in is a kind of peer-driven conversation to try and identify what are the likely objections they're facing, what kinds of data can they gather, how can they reframe the challenge, how can they respond to the objections, who do they need to speak with, and they literally create scripts and action plans and share them with their peers, and then engage in a process of refining and enhancing them. The idea here is that we're creating a safe space, or a kind of values laboratory, to spur creativity. The thing is, people in business and in many organizations, you know, they're not motivated by constraints on action. They're not motivated by thou shalt nots. They're motivated by the desire to get things done, to build their enterprise, to make money, to be successful, to enhance their careers, to serve others, to create useful services or products, etc. And so what we've done is we've reframed the values-driven challenge in such a way that it's triggering that innovative thinking, that creativity thinking. It's not about thou shalt not, it's about can do. We're asking people to show that they're smart and sophisticated, not by being the voice of skepticism or cynicism, you know, the folks who say, well, I know what you want me to say, Mary, but in the real world it's not possible. Instead, we're asking people to show they're sophisticated and savvy and smart by coming up with an effective way to do the thing that everybody thinks it's impossible to do. So that's the basic idea behind GVV. We created hundreds of these pieces of material, cases and teaching plans and exercises and readings. There's books, there's videos, there's online interactive modules. We're creating a free MOOC, which will be ready by the summer. Most of the materials are free. Some of them, where we produce them with other companies, there's a small charge for them. But the idea is that, you know, it's really a very simple idea. You don't even need to use our materials. The basic idea is just this kind of reframe. Instead of asking what's right, we ask people, how do you get the right thing done? And what's interesting is that once people get used to asking it that way, a lot of things that felt impossible start to feel possible. I've had the experience of being in focus groups in companies when I'm sharing GVV there, and there will be, I was in a focus group recently in Nigeria, actually, with a group of employees from Unilever, and they were sharing some challenges that they faced, that, you know, values and ethics conflicts. And there was one woman, and you know, it was a group of 6 or 7 employees, and they were all busy, and you know, most of them were really not that interested in having this conversation with me, the outside consultant who came in. So, you know, they're on their phones and doing other things while someone is speaking. And at one point, one of the women in the room, the middle manager, started telling this story about being told to do something by her boss. And it was clearly, you know, against corporate policy. It was also, you know, unethical. And she raised a question. She said, well, you know, I don't really think that's appropriate. And I guess the guy had just kind of yelled at her and said, I don't care, just do it. So, you know, I asked her, I said, well, what happened? And she said, well, I didn't do it. And it was actually kind of comical, because all of the other people in the room who really were not paying attention when they weren't the person speaking suddenly dropped what they were doing and looked up and turned to look at her. And everybody said at the same time, what happened? You know, she had defied her boss, who had, you know, yelled at her and ordered her to do this. And she kind of paused and sort of leaned back in her chair and smiled slightly and said, nothing. And it was it was an interesting moment. We ended up talking about it as a group, which is that we don't mean to deny that retaliation exists. Of course it does. And we don't mean to say that it's always easy or that defying your boss is a good idea in most circumstances. But rather, people assume that things are impossible that may not be. And the fact that she'd had that experience just sort of opened a crack in that kind of perception. We limit ourselves. We sort of preemptively limit ourselves. So it's been interesting to just engage in this reframe conversation. So I'm going to wrap up the discussion of GVV by simply just identifying the 3 GVV flips or reversals. So we've reversed what it is we think we're talking about when we talk about values and ethics. We've reversed who we think we're talking to in the organization, and we've reversed how we're having the conversation. So in terms of what we're talking about, people will often say to you when it comes to ethics, you know, don't bother discussing the so-called black and white, clear-cut, right-wrong issues. Those are easy. You should really focus on the gray issues where it's much more complicated. I used to think that was true. That was certainly the approach we took when I was at Harvard Business School. But I've actually changed my mind. Of course, there are a lot of gray issues, and I don't know what the right thing to do is in most of those situations, you know. But the point is that those are situations where reasonable people of goodwill and intelligence can legitimately disagree. That's why they're gray. But nevertheless, there are a lot of issues where most of us, not everybody, but most of us would agree, you know, that's clearly over the line. That's clearly fraudulent or abusive or illegal. And even though most of us would agree to that, it doesn't mean that it's easy to get it done or that our organization isn't often suspect to or susceptible to those kinds of behaviors. And so what we've decided with the GVV pedagogy is we're going to focus on scenarios that address those so-called black and white issues so that we can actually get to the question of action. If we focus on the gray issues, people will spend the whole conversation debating, you know, how many angels dance on the head of a pin, and they never actually get to action planning. And so we actually start from a place, these are those post-decision making cases where we're starting from the place where this is a pretty clear-cut issue. Our experience and our assumption is that if more people could act in these clear-cut issues, we would have made a huge amount of progress. But also, if we get better at talking about these so-called black and white issues, it will actually make us more effective at having the conversation about the gray issues as well. Now, the second flip or reversal is who we think we're talking to. You know, usually I'll go into an organization or school and people will say, you know, most of the people here are good people. We just have a few bad apples. And those are the ones this program is for. But I think of the audience differently. This is actually based on some research done by the late Greg Dees and Peter Crampton on ethics and negotiations. But we tend to think about the classroom or the organization or the work group as a bell curve. And at one tail end of the bell curve, we premise there are the folks who would self-identify as opportunists. These are the people who would say, I'll do whatever it takes to maximize my personal self-interest. Values be damned. Now, no one falls into one of these categories all the time, but these are people who would say they were primarily motivated that way. And at the other tail end are the folks who would self-identify as idealists, who will say, I'll always try and act on my values, regardless of the impact on my self-interest. We premise is that the majority of the folks in the organization fall under the bell. I put myself there. And these are the folks we call pragmatists. And we define pragmatists as people who would say, I'll always try and act on my values, regardless. These are folks who say, of course I'd like to act on my values, as long as it doesn't put me at a systematic disadvantage. That means not as long as I'll never pay a price or as long as I know I'll succeed. It's not that, but rather as long as I think I have a shot. Now, if you define your audience that way, I don't really believe we have the power to transform the opportunists. I think some of them will always be with us. And I'm not so worried about the idealists, although I would like them to be more skillful. But we do focus on the pragmatists, and we say we want to give you the skills, the literal scripts, importantly the rehearsal, the practice, the peer coaching, and the positive examples to be who you already want to be at your best. We're not trying to change you, we're trying to empower you. And then the last flip is how we do all this, and I've already explained that, is by asking a different question. Instead of what is the right thing to do, we ask, how do you get the right thing done? Now, I'm running short on time. I wanted to spend a little bit of time on how organizations have been using GVV, and I'd be happy to do that. This is my last slide, and this list of 5 things are some of the challenges that organizations face when they try and address values and ethics, and I'd be happy to talk about how GVV addresses each of them. But I'm going to take a pause before I do that to see if there's some folks who would like to chime in with comments or suggestions or questions, because if we don't get to this last part, I can always send you an article that explains what I was going to say, and I want to make sure you have a chance to speak. So Ryan or Bob, could one of you moderate that?
Sure, yeah. Thanks, Mary. That was so insightful. I love your stories that you tell along with all of the explanation. Very profound. Folks that are joining in, we can see all of the participants. We've got about 17 people. Some of you are joining online and some of you are joining by phone. Hopefully, most of you can find the icon to raise your hand if you have a comment or a question for Mary. Now's the time. Please put up your hand, and what we'll do is unmute your microphone when we see a hand go up. So we'll give folks a second to formulate a question or comment, and we will.
The other option is to add to write a question in the little question pane on the right side of your screen. Just click that open and send a question if you prefer not to speak.
And while we're waiting, I'm just going to click to the next slide so you can see. Oh, it didn't work. There we go. If you're curious about anything or want to ask me any questions after the call, these are the websites and my email address.
Great.
I'll start with a question, Mary. This is Bob. What is the youngest age of people with whom your approach has been used? I'm asking this question because I know that one of our participants is involved with a school board that deals with elementary and secondary education. So has this been used with with elementary school children or in secondary schools?
That's a great question, Bob. Thanks. Yeah, it's interesting. The last few years, when I travel around every week giving talks about this around the world, and the last few years, it seems like that question comes up almost every time I talk about GVV. And so increasingly, there are people who are experimenting with this at the elementary and secondary levels. In particular, there's a gentleman in South Africa who has started working with a network of, I think it's like 100 different schools, but he started working with a network of schools there, and I've been in touch with him. We've been Skyping, and he's trying to adapt the materials and also develop a series of scenarios that are relevant to that level of audience. So it's very easily adaptable. If somebody is curious about that, I'd be more than happy both to explain how you do it, but also to put you in contact with some of the folks who've started to experiment with using it with different age groups. People have also started to use it with, sports teams, kids' sports teams. You asked who the youngest was, and I'll just tell you a little story because I think it's fun. There's a guy I've worked with. He's a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, and I've shared GVV with U.S. Air Force Academy where they've experimented with it. And then he was seconded to the Pentagon to work with a Rear Admiral Klein there, who invited me to come speak about GVV with representatives from all the branches of the military who were trying to address issues around values and leadership. And he told a story, which I had not heard until he was introducing me. But he said that he had heard me speaking about this is this lieutenant colonel from the Air Force. He'd heard me speaking about GVV at some conference, I don't even know where, and that he liked the idea, and he'd gone home and he'd started having conversations with his kids at the dinner table. And his kids were two little girls, and at the time, I guess the younger one was maybe like 6 or something. And he said one day he came home from dinner, and this little girl, who he said was about as big around as a toothpick, came running into the room and saying, "Daddy, Daddy, I used GVV on the playground today, and it worked." And then she told this story about how there were these two little bully boys who were beating up another little boy. And nobody was doing anything about it. The teachers weren't around and none of the other students. And so his daughter, this little girl, just stood there and started haranguing them, I guess, and, telling them they shouldn't be doing this and they really should stop. And she just wouldn't stop. And apparently one of the boys kind of, gave up in disgust and just walked away. And the other boy just threw himself on the ground because he didn't know what else to do. He was sort of flummoxed by her behavior. But she was very empowered by the whole experience. So that's the youngest that I'm aware of. But if you do have folks who are interested in this, I invite them to email me, and I'd be happy to share how it can be adapted and also put you in touch with folks who use the approach.
Yeah, that's
Thank you. I'm going to unmute one of our participants now. Here you go.
Chris Ellis.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. I am the school trustee, but I'd love to have that material. But we're going through school closures in our district right now, and I'm connecting with communities that have capacity, and in meeting with them, they're very supportive of the school that's up for closure, which primarily serves the low-income, marginalized communities. And they prefer to go to a school that has more opportunity for university pathways. And I quite often hear, and it goes to who is in this bell curve, and it's exactly, they're supportive of that school that we're looking to close, but in their self-interest, they want their children to go to this other school. And I'm just wondering how, I'm struggling with how to bring that conversation up and break down, it's perfectly understandable they want the best for their children, but then how do we get to these values that they're espousing and get them thinking in a different way?
Right, and so just to help me understand, are they parents who are, I mean, they're taking their students out of the school and that's why the school is closing? Or I'm trying to understand the chain of causality here.
Yes, that's parents with capacity are either finding a way to go to, well, they go to a different school board, they'll take the private route, or they'll go to this other school. In our school board, they found a way to meet the criteria to not go to the school that's under pressure and go to the school that they think is more desirable.
Right, and that's why the school's under pressure, because it's having declining enrollments?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So yeah, so I guess I'll say two things. The first thing I'll say is, obviously it's a bigger conversation, and I would be more than happy to set a time to speak with you in some detail about it. You know, just email me and we can do that. But the second thing I'll say is that I think from a GVV perspective, we would actually, you know, try and engage these parents in a conversation where we'd be not necessarily trying to persuade them immediately to keep their students in the school that's under pressure, but to actually engage them in the process of how can we solve this problem. Because one of the things that we've learned is that it's kind of the, you know, if you have a piano you want to move and you ask people, will you come help me move the piano, and they usually have something else they have to do. But if you go to people and say, I have this piano I want to move, can you help me think about ways I can get it done? People get engaged in solving the problem, and then sometimes that means they get engaged in solving the problem. And so it's kind of that sort of an approach, you know. So you know, getting them engaged and thinking about how, you know, they've already stated this is a value they have, this is a value we share, we take them at their word, and then we actually get them engaged in problem solving around that. And, you know, some of that may mean deciding that, you know, that they should keep their students in the school, but some of them might mean being involved in how do we enhance the school so that it in fact becomes an even better sort of college preparatory kind of experience, and they get engaged in that. So what we would try and do is shift the nature of the conversation so that you're not necessarily framing it as a yes, no, go, right, wrong situation, but more of a problem-solving kind of question. And that's part of what we do in almost all the GVV scenarios. We try and take the emotion down and take the, even though this grew out of an effort to talk about morals and ethics, we try and take the emotion down and shift it into more of a problem-solving kind of conversation, because it taps into a different type of engagement in the folks that you're trying to influence. So that's a simple answer. Obviously, we'd have to be more complex than that, and that's a conversation I'd be happy to have with you.
Well, great. Certainly, if I'm able to keep the school open, I'll be in touch.
Okay, I will keep my fingers crossed for you.
Yeah, good luck, Chris, and thanks for your comment. We have a question in the one of the chat boxes. Maybe I'll just read it out loud. Is the GVV process more effective if decision makers, as well as those petitioning for change, are also trained in or aware of this approach?
I'm not sure I understand the question, meaning are they aware of what GVV is? I think if that's what the questioner means, I think yes, but it's not necessary. So let me explain what I mean. That what I've seen in organizations is that once we talk about GVV and we have these practice conversations and we get people engaged in it, then it becomes something that people can point to. It kind of gives them an excuse, a rationale, a justification, a legitimization of raising issues. So, you know, that's a useful and helpful thing. But it's not necessarily the only way to do this, because GVV is based on many, many scenarios and experiences of people who found ways to voice their values who had never heard of GVV, and GVV didn't exist when they did it. In fact, their experiences inspired me to create this approach. So I think that the approach itself is what's important. And there's a set of pillars. I mean, there's a lot more than what I was able to cover in 20 minutes today, but you know, there's a lot of different tools, and I'd be happy to share. Most of it's all available, as I say, for free download. But so you don't have to know about GVV to use the approach. It's just that GVV kind of gives you this legitimization. I'll give you an example. I was doing this work at Unilever, and my experience there, I was supposed to design an intervention that we would use to train a group of middle managers who would then, you know, hand-selected 35 high potentials, who would then cascade the approach down throughout the organization. So it was kind of a train the trainer that I was doing. And, you know, I did the reconnaissance trip to gather stories that were relevant to Lagos and Nigeria, etc. And a few weeks before I was scheduled to make my second trip to Lagos, I got a call from my contact at Unilever who said, Mary, we were wondering if you would switch your program, and instead of doing a training just for this 35 hand-picked sort of middle manager change champions, we'd like to bring the entire group of senior leadership for Unilever Nigeria, which was about 10 or 12 people, into the room at the same time and conduct the training together. Now, as you can imagine, this is both, you know, a wonderful idea to engage leadership. It's also somewhat, I was also, to be frank with you, somewhat unnerved by it because I wasn't really sure how it would work. But we did something new, and it worked really well, and I'll share it because I think it starts to respond to your question, which is that we introduced them all to the methodology through online modules and then through in-person training. But at a certain point in the day, when they all were familiar with the approach and we were ready to give them some Unilever Nigeria specific GVV style scenarios to script an action plan around, we put all the middle managers at their own tables, and then we put all the senior leaders at other tables. And we asked the middle managers to consider how would you raise these issues effectively and to create scripts and action plans, the traditional GVV exercise. But we asked the senior leaders to answer a different question. We asked them to think about how could a middle manager bring this issue to you in a way that would make it easier for you to hear and respond to it effectively. And so when we brought them all back together for the debrief, this kind of natural process of social contracting started to emerge. And the senior leaders were kind of saying, you know, if you could only raise it in these ways, if you could bring this kind of data, if you could understand, you know, how it will make it easier for me to respond, you know, I can, you know, be more welcoming and more open to this and hear you better. And the middle managers were saying, you know, if you would respond in these ways, it will make it easier for me to actually have the courage to bring these to you. And they started engaging in this process, and they actually, it was their idea, not mine. They created this document. They called it the GVV deal, where there were a set of commitments that the senior leadership made and that the middle managers made, and it was kind of a reciprocal agreement. So that's a case where, you know, knowing about GVV and being able to use it as a kind of framing language enabled them to do this. But I don't think that's the only way this can happen.
Great, thanks, Mary. I think, Bob, we have another question en français. Maybe you want to cover that one?
Yes. Yeah. Est-ce possible d'avoir un exemple d'implantation de la méthode JVV dans une organisation? Could we have an example of implementing the GVV method within an organization? So I think this caller this person is asking something along those lines of what does it look like to start from zero and get going in an organization? I hope I've interpreted correctly.
Right, that's helpful, Bob. Thank you. I went back to this slide because these are the kinds of things that typically are challenges. And so for whomever is asking that question, if you email me afterward, I will send you an article which describes how this typically gets used in organizations. But let me say briefly, I work with a lot of different companies. We've worked with Lockheed Martin, we've worked with Unilever, we've worked with Prudential, we've worked with McKinsey, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, Magnetrol, etc. And they all use it slightly differently. And I really designed GVV to be very flexible because my experience, I was designing it for business education, and business schools all have different sets of constraints and resources, and businesses and other organizations do as well. But the typical approach, it's sometimes done. Most of the organizations I've worked with have done it through a kind of train the trainer model. I'm really not trying to drum up. I don't have a consulting business. I don't want to do extensive training, and I actually think. You'll see the third bullet here, source. I actually think there's a greater credibility if the discussions come from within the organization. That's typically a challenge when it comes to ethics and values because often the managers don't feel comfortable or equipped to have that conversation. But since GVV frames these conversations as action planning, scripting, problem solving, it actually is drawing on a set of skills that the managers do have. So typically, in some way, shape, or form, whether it's in person, whether it's through online modules, etc., we introduce the concept and the general giving voice to values reframe, the thought experiment. That can be done rather briefly. I gave you a very high-level overview of it today. And then typically an organization will use some of the existing GVV style scenarios, whether they're written or video or online, or, and I think this is most effective, develop their own custom scenarios. These can be no more than a paragraph. They're easy to do, and I often help companies to structure them initially. We'll go back and forth by email. It's really typically how they frame the issue that's important. That is, that they don't fall back into debating whether something's appropriate or ethical or legal, but rather that they're focused on action planning. And they generate opportunities for employees to work in teams, to create scripts and action plans, to rehearse those, to peer coach, and to present them. And so it becomes a different type of ethics training. But the idea is that it's not just the training, that once you've understood this reframe and some of the tools, we have a whole set of tools, once you've understood those are things that can be easily brought into any kind of meeting discussion. A manager can be equipped to always flip the question in the way that we do with GVV. An employee is always equipped with a set of 3 or 4 or 5 or 6, we call them levers, that they can use to try and reframe and influence a particular decision. So the key idea behind it can be communicated rather briefly, but what makes it effective is through repetition, through practice, through peer coaching, through rehearsal, and there's many different ways that people can set that up. It can be in-person training, it can be following the in-person training, it can be social media type drumbeat, and I can give you examples if you're interested of how companies have done that.
Wow, so interesting.
But feel free to email me if you want articles with more detail. I'm trying to go fast.
Yeah.
Mary, I'd like to pose a follow-up question to that because I know that the questioner comes from a particular sort of organization. You mentioned before contacts with the American military, and that poses the issue for me, where you have a strong command and control culture and ingrained processes, as in the military and police organizations. Is there something particular that you would say about them that you don't that you wouldn't necessarily see in other kinds of organizations?
It's a great question. It's interesting because that would have been my assumption too, Bob. But what I found when I go into organizations is that even in just your regular garden variety company, they'll actually feel that even organizations that see themselves as participative, there's something that we I think kind of naturally do when it comes to hierarchies, where we have a kind of sense that we're supposed to defer. It's social psychologists have done research on it. They call it obedience to authority. There is a tendency to credit and defer to whoever is in authority in a particular situation. Now, when you get into a situation like the military, I've had these conversations about, chain of command, which of course is a hugely important phenomenon, because if you're in combat or something, people need to be able to know that someone has their back. And so it is a real thing, but I guess what I want to point out is that I think people think it's real in other settings as well. And so the challenge doesn't become whether you can do GVV in those kinds of environments, because everyone thinks they're in that kind of environment. What's happened, though, when I go into places that are more sort of convinced that they are, or literally are, more authoritarian, the way of framing GVV, and one of the reasons why I often call it not business ethics, but I call it an approach to values-driven leadership development, is the way to approach it is around leadership. Because if you're in a military context, although there is a real chain of command and a deference to authority, there also is a high value placed on leadership in all its manifestations. And in fact, I've found in the U.S. military more and more there really is an awareness that there needs to be, true leaders need to be able to know how to resist authority appropriately and at the right time and respectfully and effectively. And so, for example, one of the areas in the U.S. military where I've gotten some of the most traction in the U.S. is, I'm sure many of you have read, there have been a lot of scandals and accounts around sexual harassment and even violence. And so there's all kinds of programs in the U.S. military. The Army has something called SHARP, which means Sexual Harassment, Assault, Resources, and Prevention. And so they have been working on this initiative to empower everyone to be able to raise these issues effectively. And so they've actually brought me in to do some webinars with them. And of course, the whole issue is, but what if it's your commanding officer, that kind of situation? And what we found is that we approach it the same way. We frame it as leadership. GVV is not about whistleblowing. It's not about shaking your fist at someone. It's really about framing the issue in a way that makes it easier, that brings the emotion down, that enables people to feel like they have an out, that can save face when necessary. I'll tell you one example. I did a program for the Coast Guard, and the U.S. Coast Guard, and one of the people in the audience told me this story about, I guess there's a policy or a norm or a ruling that if you are approaching a ship where it's burning or it's on fire or there's some other kind of danger, you're not supposed to go below deck. Even if you think there might be somebody there, there's this sort of sense that you don't want to risk more people. And so there were certain kinds of rules about this. And they told the story about a young Coast Guard officer, very young, inexperienced, and they took a helicopter out because there was a boat that was on fire. And he could tell that the captain was below deck. And he really believed that he could save him. And so even though he was aware of the obligation or the regulation, he did. He went below deck and he saved the captain, and they both got out. And the guy who was telling me the story was kind of the ethics officer for the Coast Guard. And he said that after this event happened, the commanding officer, I believe it was an admiral, called him into his office and said, I have this young man who rescued the captain and his parents in a conference room right now, and I need to decide what I'm going to do about this. I need to decide whether I'm going to dismiss him, whether I'm going to punish him, or whether I'm going to acknowledge him for doing something successfully. And he said, he broke the rules. What do you think? And he's asking the ethics officer. And the guy who was telling me the story said, he was sweating bullets. He didn't know what to say, and it was the admiral. But he said, he basically said, I actually think we're training people to be leaders. We're training them to use judgment. The rules are important. But we need to think about why the rules were created and how and when they are appropriately or even were required to break them. And he said, so I think that although you should, stress all of those things, so it's not this kind of blanket, oh, ignore the rules, I think in this case he should not be punished. And he should be thanked for saving the captain. And the admiral kind of gave him, the guy who told me the story said the admiral gave him a steely glare, and then basically said, I think you're right. And I've actually run into other stories like that when I was working with other branches of the military. I won't tell the story now, but a story about a guy who similarly broke the policy when they were in Iraq in order to save a civilian. And one of the things that they talk about is that there are times when we need to disobey orders. Orders were created for good reasons, and we need to understand the reasons they were created, and understanding the reasons, it will help us know when to break them and also how to break them in a way that respects the rule rather than destroys the rule. And so that's what GVV would be about in a situation like that. It would be about problem solving. It wouldn't be about whether or not to save someone. It would be about whether or how you can do it in a way that actually preserves order and the discipline that's necessary.
Great, thank you. We also have one more question, Mary, and maybe we have time for it. I think we have about 3 minutes left of your time. So Martine has asked, can you run us through a black and white issue and how to apply GVV to it?
Sure, let me do a really quick one because I know we don't have a lot of time. One of the Giving Voice to Values cases, and if you all go to the website, you'll be able to download this and read it in more detail. I'll just go briefly. One of the cases is called The Client Who Fell Through the Cracks. And it was a business scenario. They're all based on real situations, but disguised. It was a business scenario. A young financial analyst who was working for a company that managed the portfolios of high net worth individuals. And the company had gone through a lot of transitions. She was new. Her boss was new. She got called into her boss's office one morning, and he said to her, look, we're going to have a meeting. I'm going to have a meeting this afternoon with one of our clients. He's a good friend of the senior director of the firm, but he's, by our standards, a smaller portfolio client, an elderly gentleman, not a very sophisticated investor, who's made a lot of money with his business and is now retired, and we're managing his portfolio, which he wants to bequeath to his children. And we set a series of benchmarks for this portfolio, and the portfolio has significantly underperformed the benchmarks that we set. So I want you to go back and create a deck of PowerPoints that, construct an alternate benchmark that will make it look as if the portfolio has done better, that I can present to him this afternoon, because he won't know the difference. Now, this young analyst, didn't think that was appropriate, but she didn't know her boss. She was new to the firm. He was new to the firm. She wasn't really sure if do they do this all the time? What is this? And she was a little flummoxed. There wasn't a lot of time. So we, as a GVV case, we would end the case with this woman knowing that she doesn't want to do this, knowing that it's wrong, but not sure how to proceed. And we would give the participants the opportunity to create a script and action plan around this. And then we have a B case about what she actually did in the scenario, and which we would share afterwards. People would present their scripts and action plans. They would enhance them. I've used this with many different groups, from undergraduates to graduate students to business managers to senior executives to ethics professionals and attorneys, and they all have slightly different responses. When we give the B case out, what happens is that she took all the reasons that people give for why you can't act in this situation. There wasn't enough time. She really didn't know her boss well enough to have this kind of conversation with him. What if this is in fact the norm in this organization? The client is a good friend of the managing director of the firm, so what if we are reporting a failing a portfolio, all of those things. She flipped all of those and used them to her advantage. So basically what she did is she first went and asked a colleague, is this normal operation here? I mean, this doesn't seem right to me. And her colleague said, no, of course it's wrong, but, maybe you should go ahead and do it, because if you don't, he's just going to ask me to do it, So she didn't feel like by resisting, she was necessarily going to be helping the client, and she'd be hurting herself and her relationship with her manager. So what she did is she went to her boss and she said, but she also felt like she didn't know him well enough to say, I think there's an ethical issue here. That was her discomfort. So the way she presented it was she went to him and said, look, I don't think I really have time to create an entirely different benchmark and set of analyses here that would accomplish what you're asking for. But what I can do, and what I have done in time for this meeting today, is I've created a set of slides and a script for you that explains exactly where the portfolio went off track at each point and why, and what we will do next quarter going forward to address each point. And she shared that with her boss. And, she didn't know whether he would accept it or not, but he said, okay. And he tried it and he shared it with the client, and the client said, the client wasn't thrilled, but the client said, okay. And they went on. And, her conclusion was that her manager was not invested in being unethical. Her manager was invested in getting through a very difficult conversation. And so what she did is she reframed the challenge. She gave him an alternate way to get through the conversation by literally scripting him and giving him all the tools and the anticipation of the concerns and objections and responses so that he would be able to effectively respond. She basically brought his anxiety down for dealing with the client. Now, we always tell people, these things don't work in every situation. They're not easy. It's not even necessarily always possible to do this, but it's important, and we can get better at it. And we get better at it through rehearsal and practice, and also by recognizing that things that we think are impossible are not always impossible. And so in this circumstance, simply by framing it differently, she was able to get through. Sometimes people will say to me, but she didn't tell him it was unethical. The fact is, she felt like she didn't know him well enough at that point to have that conversation, that it would have just led him to dig in, and it would have wrecked her relationship with him. She believed that at some level he knew why she was doing that, but it allowed him to save face and for them to go forward building a basis for a relationship which hopefully would be able to be more forthcoming in future situations. So that's just kind of a very quick example. We've got many, many others. We've got cases that are much more complex about systemic corruption in India. We've got cases about sustainability challenges where people are trying to voice their values affirmatively rather than negatively to get people to move in new directions. We've got cases that have to do with supply chain and honesty in reporting and effective treatment of employees and customers. Happy to answer any questions by email after today.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mary. What a great story. Okay, well, I've got lots more questions for you as well, but I think we're sort of out of time, and I'm sure other people do as well. So hopefully you'll probably be getting some emails, I bet, from people. And thanks for being so accessible and willing to, respond to those. It's wonderful. It's been a real pleasure.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, and Bob.
Go ahead,
Bob here. Just thank you very much on behalf of the participants and also on behalf of the Ethics Practitioners Association for your contributions. It's really important to bring this thinking to people's attention, and I hope that with having this material on our website, that it'll then get used by more people and they'll see the potential of your approach. Thanks very much.
I appreciate that. Thanks very much, everybody. And I'll log off on now because I know you guys are going to have another conversation.
Thanks, Mary.
Thanks, Mary.
Okay.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
You too.
Ryan, could you go through the last few slides and then bring it back to the next one, just so people know that we have both some more discussion that we want to stimulate, that we also have some evaluation questions that we'd like them to answer.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm going to do that now. So let's do the last two then, and then we'll go back. Is that right, Bob? Is that what you're thinking? So what we're thinking, yeah, okay. Yeah, so if you want to use the question box that people have been entering questions into as a way to rate the webinar or give us any feedback, that would be really useful. We'd really appreciate that. Obviously, EPAC is planning more webinars in the future. We're thinking about having Mary come back and do some additional webinars in the future. We've spoken to her briefly about that, and I think she's on board with that possibility. So we'd be interested in any topics that people would, think would be that they'd like to hear about related to giving voice to values, and any additional feedback you can give on how we can improve EPAC webinars. We're open to any feedback that people have. You can also send your comments on this webinar to service@EPAC.APEC, or sorry, -APEC.CA, or you can go to the EPAC website for the presentation and as well as to become a member. So I think I'm going to go back now. So what we thought we could do for people that can stay on for just a few more minutes is maybe discuss a few of these questions. I'm really excited by Mary's work. I'm sure other people find it also resonates with them to some degree, and looking forward to hearing what people might think about how it differs from the more traditional views of organizational ethics. I wonder if anybody has any comments on that.
Yes, Chris.
Anybody else have any comments with regard to how this approach to called giving voice to values differs from more traditional views of organizational ethics? Okay, I don't see any hands up, but you can also type in your question box if you have any comments that you'd like to share. Bob, I know I have one thought and comment that maybe I'll just share, and then maybe you can chime in if no one else has comments. But one of the things that strikes me about Mary's approach is that, normally when we talk about ethics and we focus on decision-making models, and we're focused on what she calls awareness and analysis, we're often appealing to more universal principles and maxims. And those often don't take into consideration the very complex, specific factors in social and organizational dynamics. So I think taking this more practice-based, action-based approach where we assume that we know what's right and we're looking at how can we implement it and being very strategic and creative about that actually allows people to take into consideration the very complex environments that they work within. So that's one thing that I noticed. I think you now have a hand up, or unless maybe you didn't take it down. I think that's an additional. So let me just go to you for a second and see if you have a comment.
Yeah, I had just how it might be applied to my organization. That the educational sector has a lot of power blocks. Mm-hmm. And each comes from a different starting point and sort of responsibilities, thinking of our district staff, which are very much constrained by the financial obligation, which is given to us by another power block, our provincial government. So we sometimes have trouble breaking out of these boxes, and I think that GVV might be a way that we can start to get people going beyond their constraints and then working. I very much liked looking for solutions, and I think there are solutions even within the constraints that we have that the organization could find. So I'm excited about that way of thinking about it. And that was very, what I took from this was this different way of viewing a really intractable problem. Thanks, I'm done.
Great, thanks, Chris. That's a great comment. And okay, so any other thoughts? And feel free to answer some of the other questions you see on your slide. If you have any comments related to those, that's fine too. So how might GVV influence your view on organizational ethics? Or how might giving voice to values be applied in your organization, and what difference could it make? So any other comments out there? I don't see any hands going up, but Bob, do you have any comments related to any of these questions that you'd like to share?
I think what was occurring to me is a different way of saying what Chris was just bringing up, which has to do with the assumption that a difference of views or that a dilemma is quote unquote a problem, and that we have this one paradigm which is a problem is something to be solved. But there was a management writer that I liked who talked about you don't just have to solve problems, you can also dissolve problems, you can resolve problems. There's different approaches, and one of them that just occurred to me was that she kept saying things about reframing the issue, like that long example that she gave. The boss wasn't really out to deceive the client. The boss was just looking for some way to have a successful outcome, and so the subordinate presented an alternative way of framing the issue and gave tools. And I think that the school board situation is one in which there's almost an a priori assumption that there's opposed camps and that there's no common ground, and it's going to be a fight until one side gives up. So the emphasis seems to be more on finding the common ground.
Yes.
I see that, Christian, that there's another hand up. Do you want to take care of unmuting that person?
Yep, go ahead, Chris.
I don't think I can talk.
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah, we can hear you.
We hear you.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, I'll just repeat basically what I typed. First of all, thanks a lot for this webinar. It was very interesting. First time I participate, I really enjoyed it. What I noted was the strong focus on problem solving, which came to me as not a surprise, but it was very different to the approach that I was trained under during a certificate at Carleton University based on the Insight mediation training there, where a lot of the focus is put on everything else that is at stake in a given situation or conflict. Learning, namely, from emotions, from interests that may be behind in a given conflict that may be at play there. And we were specifically asked to refrain from going to problem-solving approaches. So, and I remember examples of being in a mediation training, and for sure, it's easy to go to, okay, how could we solve this problem? What would be the best approach? And often the coaches or the professors would tell us, no, just don't go there yet. Try to learn a bit more from this situation. And the learning was, the theory was that the learning taking place would help us to transform the conflict, right? So it was a bit of a very different approach, in other words, to hear about this quick focus on problem solving, which I appreciated.
Great. Well, thanks for the comment. That's really well put. And I'm glad it resonated with you. We also had a couple of comments from one, which was she said she thinks that this method is different. In the fact that it focuses on, or allows people to focus on themselves and their actions and not oppose the view of others necessarily. So it sort of works within, I guess, similar to the problem solving, but I think I'm hearing that comment as maybe it's more focused on the individual that's got the values conflict and how they can resolve that within their context. So I thought that was a good comment. There's also another comment here about the fact that she thinks GVV would help ethical people in her organization to be stronger in applying ethics. So that's interesting as well. Okay, great. So I'm not sure if anybody else has any other comments. I know for me, I was interested in maybe in the future hearing from Mary about some of the common criticisms that she might get from either the sort of more traditional ethicist or philosopher types versus the teachers and educators within organizations, and see, whether folks that are used to doing the pre-decision making versus the post-decision making part of education, we're pushing back on her approach, and be interesting to sort of know a little bit more whether there's a debate going on or not, and how she's responding to some of those potential objections. I just think it'd be interesting to understand if that discourse is happening. Because it seems like with her work, it's quite groundbreaking. It's probably challenging. I think it challenges some fundamental assumptions about the way ethics is taught and the way leadership is promoted within organizations. So that's just a comment I had. So any other comments from anybody else? I guess the main one for us at EPAC is to understand what folks would like to hear in the future. If they would like another webinar with Mary Gentile, it seems like the comments are overall very positive. Wondering if anybody has any specific ideas about what we could focus on. I see put a comment in about a future webinar on how to implement GVV in an organization, maybe focusing on either one organization as a case study and seeing what that looks like, or maybe having people from different organizations participate in that webinar. So that's an interesting idea. Thank you for that, Chris. Does anybody else have any comments about this? Please feel free to raise your hand. We're just about out of time, so we'll take maybe one last comment. Feel free also to type it into the question box at the bottom of your screen or the side of your screen.
Well, I think that I would like to thank Ryan for having been the organizer for this webinar. And Ryan was in touch a lot with Mary to make sure that we shape this in a way that would get something useful done within our time period. And I really appreciate your doing so, Ryan. Je voudrais aussi remercier les gens qui sont habitués à écouter ces choses plutôt en français, parce que je sais que c'est un peu plus d'effort de participer en anglais. And so thank you to both our Francophone and our Anglophone participants. I think this was extremely enjoyable. And in any case, so I think we can close up now. Ryan?
Yeah, thank you everybody for joining in. We're really excited by the EPAC webinars, and we'll be hosting some more in the near future. And remember to pay attention to your email. If you're a member that signed up for our e-newsletter, you'll be getting some communications about future webinars, and hopefully more with Mary Gentile. And for those of you who are not members of EPAC currently, we'd love to have you on board as a member. You can go to the website, which has been listed at the bottom of the slides and is easily findable. And yeah, we look forward to more meaningful dialogue in the future. Thank you, everybody.